I mean, Donald has left. He, he has liberated himself. um, yeah, I wanted to pull it a little bit together. So the part of the discussion now is we open it up for everybody and the panel. And but the question that we were left before the break was, can not being free serve a useful purpose? That was the core question. And um, I'm just thinking because I mean, we went partially into, in particular, went partially into the availability of energy. That if there would be freedom, there would be much more energy available to attend to um, what needs to be attended to. I guess there will be less loss. But somehow, I think, and I could follow what Patrick was mentioning, okay, but there are other ways that we also gain a lot of energy because life is becoming, due to technological progress, and which also has an effect on our brain and our cooperation. And the other question we had was, is it possible then to cooperate, collaborate? Like one of the outcomes of not being free is that we're driven by beliefs, assumptions, and identities. Now, is it possible? What would cooperation look like if that would not be the case? So, is it possible to collaborate not from those, but collaborate? Is it possible to collaborate not around an ideal? Is it possible to collaborate not around a motive, assumption, or an identity? And Donald Hoffman expressed, well, I mean, we might like that, but the depth of how we are cued in to our conditioning in a very unconscious way is very deep. And even as we're sitting here now, evolution is at play. Do we want it or don't we want it? And so, I mean, but I would take that more like, well, that would be an hindrance to it, but that might still be, that wouldn't exclude that cooperation would be possible without belief, identity, or assumption. So, so I thought maybe we can. I would like to keep these questions open like that. I don't think we have to answer it here, but and then open it for the public. So whoever wants to add to this. So 1, 2, 3. And this is for the panel.
It's on. Hello? Yeah? Um, yes. How deeply are we, our conditioning, how deeply are we time, space? Maybe life itself is time, space. And as a living being, I live in time, space. I create time, space as a living being. And of course, I imbue time, space with the sense of reality. Many things I imbue with a sense of reality. My personality, my image of myself, my body, all seem to be very real for me. Now, you have really, in a marvelous way, presented something that made it possible to question that reality and to say it appears as reality, has a necessary function for life, but actually it is not reality. It is an orientation, it is a setup which allows me, which allows life, which allows a body to navigate the world and do what it has to do, meaning to survive, to persist. Now, surviving and persisting actually means that suggests there is time. It actually seems to create time. And so it seems to be a fundamental of life to have time in which to grow, in which to heal, in which to feed, in which to, and finally to have children and to continue the cycle. It seems, so in a way, I also felt time-space might not have final reality, but it is at the same time a necessity for doing the job of life. So it is not that we can stop using that interface time-space. We will continue to use it, but we can use it in a new and a much more open way if we understand it only is an interface. It is not final reality. Now, then we, of course, have the question, what is final reality? And all the attempts which we do is trying to have a perception what that could be, and we try to, in a way, perceive more subtly, more completely, more inclusively, but it is always a perception. And even the most subtle perception might not be possible to see what really is, because that which finally is could not be reduced to a perception. It would be something which is irreducible, while perception does exactly that, to reduce something, and you have shown how tremendously perception reduces to this kind of desktop reality. So I wonder then, and all the attempts to go further, to go deeper, it seems they cannot happen via a process, via a perceptive experience, because that which truly is probably not a thing. It probably doesn't have a form, not a recognizable form. So to look for something which is formless, but includes all forms, but is in its true nature of formless, not a thing, not limited. I mean, everything which we, in a way, experience has to be limited in some way, because otherwise it would be open-ended. It would not be graspable. So there is an absolute divide, I feel, between exactly that, and Krishnamurti has talked about that. Something is limited. How can something which is limited ever move into the non-limited, into the unlimited, into that which might not have any form, which has no frontier, which is infinite, which is eternal, it's not of the order of time and space, right? And all the tools we have seem to be of the order of time and space, of some form, we need some limitation, some distinction in order to grasp anything. So that might be the thing which is, as he says, there is no path to truth. In some ways, we are always looking for a path. The path will always be on this desktop of time and space. Now, the other thing it seems that every reality is something which is somehow limited. What if that what is limited takes place in something, out of something which is unlimited? And that is happening right now. There is no distinction between these two things. The reality of time, space, even the reality of life, the reality of surviving, might be at the same time happening out of something, in something, which is not of that order, which is unlimited. And therefore cannot be reached from here. It just is, and it is already. But not reachable as long as we constantly produce perception. As we constantly produce, in a way, this distinction between an observer and an observed. As long as we do that, that which already is as a totality remains hidden and unseen. So I think this is very profound, and at the same time it is absolutely immediate, and it is absolutely now. And our thinking, our talking is actually happening in it already.
Was there a question in that, or no?
I mean, that is, yeah, the question is, can we see, or are we willing to be open that there is something which is not bridgeable, that there is the perceptive experience, the level of thinking, of feeling, and at the same time there is something which is not of that order, and therefore cannot be reached by further thinking and further perceiving.
Do you want to address that question to anybody in particular?
I don't know if anyone feels there is an aspect in it which could be clarified or...
I think we'll start here and we'll open it.
Right.
it's an interesting question, and when I talk as a scientist about the theory of evolution and look at what it might say about these kinds of issues, it's not because I think that that theory is by any means the final story. It's the most powerful tool we've ever come up with so far. It's a beautiful theory, but it's only a theory in our space-time interface. It has not succeeded in going beyond the interface into this other realm. It's not beyond space and time. The very predicates of evolution by natural selection, Darwinian theory, are all in a physicalist framework. And we know, physicists are now telling us that space-time, so it's not cognitive scientists who are telling us this, physicists are telling us that the space-time framework, it's had a good ride and it's over. Space-time is not well defined when you get beyond a certain scale, a tiny scale, called the Planck scale. The problem is, if you try to measure things smaller and smaller in space and time, Heisenberg's uncertainty relationship says you need to use more and more energy. And that's fine, so you can use smaller wavelength light, which is higher energy, to probe. But at some point, the amount of energy you need gets so great in such a small region of space that you create a black hole. And the very structure of space-time blows up. And what the physicists tell us is that anything that falls apart like that you can't operationalize, is not fundamental. Space-time has to be, so space-time has been a good tool, but physicists are telling us we have to let it go. So now we're trying to understand what's the deeper kind of reality. And there are two different paths that we can try to take. One is, and one reason why I'm eager to be here, and I wanted to come here, is because I think that Krishnamurti and other people from spiritual traditions who are not focusing on the science have some deep insights that I want to learn from. Right? As a scientist, I'm trying to get my insights wherever I can. On the other hand, we know from human history that each of us is deeply self-deceived. What we think are insights is more often than not nonsense. So here's the dilemma that we have, right? We really want to take seriously what people have experienced and the insights that they have. Even if I haven't had it, I can't dismiss it out of hand. There may be something really there. And I need to. On the other hand, we have the tools of science, which have proved to be extremely valuable, but they've only taken us so far. Evolution by natural selection is stuck in the interface. So now we're at this point where we would like to go beyond space-time and talk about that reality. And we, as you point out, we have a couple options. One, we can just say, one possibility is, and this is something that Rumi said, the language of God is silence, all else is poor translation. He may be right. Maybe science stops with space-time and it's impotent to go beyond. For me as a scientist, that's not a good working hypothesis. Right, so he may be right, but I'm not going to go there first, right? And even when you look at the spiritual traditions, I would actually, if a sage said what Rumi said, the language of God is silence, all else is poor translation, and they then being utterly consistent, said nothing further, I would absolutely respect that. But that's not what happens. In every tradition, including Krishnamurti, there are thousands of words. So in that case, given that people with most honest intentions can be deeply self-deceived, then I think that the scientific method is what we can use to try to figure out where we have good insights and where we're being self-deceived. right? So we actually use the scientific method to try to create precise statements of what we're saying. So to state our ideas as absolutely precisely as possible so that we can then find out precisely why we're wrong and where we're wrong. That's sort of the goal. Precision, not as a form of one-upmanship, but precision as a way of being honest, open, so that other people can say, that's where you've made the mistake. And that's how we make progress. Now, again, Rumi may be right. Maybe any statement is necessarily, from the get-go, not it. And if so, then I think that we should really take that seriously and not worry in these conversations. Just enjoy each other's company and presence, because if we're taking that seriously, there is nothing that we can say. The language of God is but if we're going to say something, then a few of us, not everybody, but a few of us need to do it in the scientific method, right? Where we try to be as absolutely precise as possible. In what I'm doing with this theory of conscious agents, I'm obviously assuming not Rumi, right? I'm trying to say something. So, and here's the motive for what I'm trying to do. I'm saying, I don't know what the nature of reality is. Can I come up with a theory in which, according to the theory, it's possible for us, first, not to be divorced from the reality. So the reason I talk about conscious agents is because I'm a conscious agent. I have conscious experiences. So this reality that I'm talking about is not something utterly alien from me. It's other agents like me. And so it proposes a reality that I can relate to, and that I could, being a conscious agent, know something about, because I am a conscious agent. Again, fallibly. But then the tools of mathematics come in to then allow us to find out, are there predictions that I'm not smart enough to figure out that come from this theory that we can then go and chase down and so forth. So I'll just close with this. I think that there's really a two-pronged approach, and that's the reason I'm here. I really am listening intensely to what people from spiritual traditions are saying, because I'm really looking for deep insights and maybe evidence that my whole approach is off the rails. On the other hand, I'm also trying to take the insights, and each one I'm saying, can I turn that into something absolutely rigorous? Can I pin that down with mathematical precision so I know exactly what the person is saying and exactly where it might be right and where it might be wrong? And that's sort of, and who knows where this will play out? I don't know, but it's fun trying.
Yes, we all know that we assume that personal suffering, the I, the self, have a lot to do with personal misery and things that on the individual level and other levels. And the question is, the model that you presented, Donald, how is that evolution even enforce that, cause to that self to even be more prominent? You can see around, it doesn't seem that it diminish with time. It's just getting more and stronger at the individual level, even though it doesn't seem to serve anything good, especially if you listen to Kay teaching in this respect. That's first question. The other one, if you the reality of the podium, of the table, but in your model that you explain of consciousness, I can understand the individual. There's many individuals, all of them see the same. How much reality is that to that table if all the people are not there? It seems to me that it's not there. I mean, it's difficult to perceive if you can. Because we live, as we discussed earlier, we live our life, and this reality is there, and if we don't move away from the car, it's over. So there is some to grasp it better, if you can elaborate on that. And the last comment I want to make regarding what was said earlier, to me, the understanding the K teaching is we have to be careful not to go to the positive, to what is our mind, our knowledge, put us in the unknown, in the other things. The best we can do is to negate what we think and what we understand. The moment you start speculating about other stuff, it's speculation.
I would, I don't know if this is on, but I would like to pick up on that point because I think that's critical in a sense that I think a whole component of this kind of conversation is whether or not we can be aware of what it means when we search for something. So in all this, we posit that there is something called an ultimate reality. But in a way, our search for that is born and motivated out of a discontent we have. And also, what we look for is necessarily built out of what we expect to be there. So we have to be careful that we don't create what we're looking for and then find it. And in finding it, feel as though we've found something real, but ultimately all we've found is more of our own business. So it seems that there's something in what actually is the scientific method that's related to this whole idea of negation, in the sense that when we move towards something, all we're really doing is moving more towards what we know to move towards, what is not. But if we can be rigorous in a sense that we can work to try and disprove what we think is the case. That somehow if we continuously remove our false ideas, there may be the ability to come to something that's not false. Or not. No, it's true. It doesn't matter. But somehow that activity is a correct activity versus the projection of ultimate reality and moving towards that can always and only be a movement towards what we expect to be there. So, I don't know. I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah. I don't know if there's any other comments about that.
Yeah, very, very good point. We do need to question why we're seeking for a positive theory. I'll come back to that in just a moment. On the question about the table and does it exist, we all have a consensus. We all agree that there's a table with a rose on top of it and so forth. When we look away, what happens? And it's the same as I showed you those cubes on the screen. It was a flat screen, but we all agreed that we saw a cube on the screen. And when we all look away, the question is, where is the cube that you saw? And the answer is, there is no cube. You create the cube in your conscious experience when you looked, and then you destroyed the cube when you looked away. And I'm arguing there was something on the screen, but it was flat. There's no three-dimensional cube. No, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think if I've understood you right, you're also saying that even when we're looking at it, it's not there. It's not that it vanishes when you're not looking at it. But even when you're looking at it, whether it's just you or whether it's everyone in the room, it doesn't, quote unquote, actually exist. So you're going one step further. It's not that it disappears when you're not looking at it.
Good clarification. So just in the same sense, so when I say the cube exists on the screen, of course, if you went up there, you wouldn't feel any. There really is no cube. So the cube that you saw was just an experience. So it exists only as an experience. Very, very good point. I'm saying the same thing about the table. It exists only as an experience. And even the experience, then, you garbage collect when you look away. On the ego, and evolution. I can give you a story from the evolutionary framework, and again, evolution is only within the space-time interface, so it's not a deeper story about the ego, and that's why I'm very interested in looking at the deeper spiritual traditions about what they see about an ego. And because I think that ultimately I would like to understand from this deeper point of view why we see the world in terms of evolution by natural selection. But I'll only use the tool that we have right now, which is evolution by natural selection. Here's the story about the ego, at least a story that comes out of that theory. Some creatures, like E. coli, have probably no self-representation or very little self-representation. But they also have very little ability to anticipate the future and problems. So in E. coli, it swims, has a flagellum, it spins it around, and it goes, and as long as a certain amino acid that it's eating has good concentrations, it keeps going in that direction. As soon as the concentrations start going down, it flips its flagellum, it spins it the other way, which is like a randomization. It sort of changes its direction randomly, and then starts spinning and going in another direction. And it works for the E. coli. There are more E. coli than there are people. You have probably more E. coli in your gut than there are people. So it works for them, but each E. coli is not terribly smart, right? And it can't anticipate problems. It can't plan to get more amino acid and store amino acid and so forth. It's at the vagaries of the environment. So what happens in evolution is that we have this trade-off. You can spend calories tracking down resources like the amino acid, or you could choose to use some of your calories to build a model of your world and how the world is affecting a you. So you build a token of you and how the world is affecting you. And that model then begins to let you predict certain things that if you took this action, it would be good for you or bad for you. So now we have, now every calorie you spend doing that is expensive because calories are not free. So evolution has this trade-off that's being done across all creatures. Do you want to spend all of your calories just foraging for more calories? Or do you want to spend some of your calories building these little models? You're not actually going out there and doing anything. You're building models. And the trade-off will be, if this model actually helps you to get more calories than you wasted on the model, then there are selection pressures to do that. And our species is one in which we literally spend 20, but Patik corrected me, maybe up to 40% of our calories up here in the modeling. But it's paid off for us handsomely. Right? We have agriculture, we have all, we're not out here all gathering and hunting and so forth. We're here relaxing. Food is easy because we have this. But the price of the model is you get a more and more sophisticated me and more sophisticated models of what that world does to me. So this is from an evolutionary point of view, the origin of the ego. The ego is there it's not the truth. It's a symbol just like the cube is a symbol, but it's a very, very useful symbol. And then, of course, part of that will be we develop feelings. Like, I want that symbol to have lots of food. I'm afraid if there's a lion that's going to attack it. So all sorts of emotions are in there from an evolutionary point of view because those motivate you to take the right action so that that ego symbol doesn't die, it gets the food it needs and so forth. So that's the evolutionary story. And of course I would love to have the deeper story about reality, of which the evolutionary story is the projection, and to understand in that deeper reality what's going on there, because I think there is something deeper. I don't think any of our current scientific theories are true. They're just the best tools we have so far. I think there are deeper insights. But now it comes back to the point that Corey made, and I think it's an important why are we going for something positive? And I think that's a really good question for us to ask ourselves. Historically, one of the reasons we went for positive theories was, for example, in the case of disease. Surgeons would be cutting people open. doing surgery on them, and then some of the people would just get horrible fevers and die, and others wouldn't. And it was horrific, and we would look and say, why are some people dying horribly and others not? And that, that was sort of the motivation. So we started to ask a why question, because people were in pain, people were dying, we were losing loved ones when we were trying to help them with surgery. And someone came along, he built this microscope and looked inside, and he saw for the first time in human history that when you look really closely, like in a drop of water, there were animals in there. I mean, there are little animals in there. And so he told people, I think the reason you're getting sick is because there are little animals in you. And you can see how that was received. Like, give me a break. That is utter, and it was actually received that way. The surgeons of the time said, that is nonsense. These people, there aren't little animals. And you say, no, there are little animals, and if you wash your hands with soap, you will get rid of those little animals, and people won't die. And for a long time, the surgeons resisted. It was sort of a macho thing. I'm going from this patient, my hands are dirty, I'm going to the next patient. Wash my hands, give me a break. And they were killing people. And so one reason, and this is different than a deep spiritual motivation, but one reason why science has asked the why and asked for positive things is because we don't want to kill people. We would like to help people. But that may not apply in this deeper. I think that there's a deeper question that you're asking, Corey, which is there, when we're going after this deeper nature of reality, and we're asking who we deeply are we going beyond that motivation of just trying to help people? Is there something deeper? And I'm open to actually looking at that, and asking, is there something deeper there? Or is it still going to be the same kind of model? If we could actually get a deeper positive theory, we might help ourselves, not perhaps just in physical disease, but maybe in emotional disease. Maybe that same model would apply. If I could get a deeper positive understanding, then I could get new positive tools for dealing with my ego, cooperating with people, letting go of my biases and prejudices, possibly. But I'm open to being told I'm wrong on that there really is, that it really should be just a negative thing, that there's no positive thing that is feasible here. So I'm open to that.
If I can just quickly respond. I'm not sure that your example is even necessarily a search for a positive. So in the sense, I would say that it's more like, to put it in a different way, way back in the day, I'm cutting people open and they're getting sick. Searching for something positive would be to say, when I cut someone open, there's a force that's coming in and causing this sickness. I'm going to search for that force and discover it. Versus looking at what's going on and then discovering that there are these little organisms. So again, even in your description, it's that's still sort of in the quote unquote negative way of approaching. So I didn't posit the problem and look for it. I saw there was an issue, and I looked into it and discovered a possible source of the issue. So again, it's something like that. There's an activity there that's different than creating what I'm looking for and then proving what I posited from the beginning. Does that make sense? Just to point that out, I think it's yeah.
I'd like to return to what we talked about this morning in terms of this introspective methods versus sort of a scientific approach to things. And one of the things that occurred to me is that my interest in Krishnamurti is not so much as a spiritualist, but as very much a pragmatist who is basically trying to communicate to us a way that we could look to discover what processes are actually going on in our brains, to produce what is. Not so much, delving into the content of it, but more in look at the processes. And one of the things that I wonder is whether or not humans are evolutionarily or otherwise very good at looking at processes. If you look at the brain as just another organ of the body, are we very good at looking at the processes of the liver in the cytochrome P450 system? Are we very good at looking at the process by which our pancreas releases insulin? Are we very good at looking at anything else? And I think we're terrible at it, probably because there's no evolutionary pressure for us to understand those processes. And if we look at the brain as just another organ of the body, there's no particular reason why we should have any proclivity to looking at processes in the brain and being able to understand those. I bring that up because, and not to beat a dead horse here, but the difficulty, the apparent difficulty in people trying to do what it is that Krishnamurti was getting them to try to look at, and that is the processes in the brain itself. So when we switch to science, when I look at science, I look at it mostly in terms of dealing with content, and I don't believe, and I'm going to sort of echo what Don said, I don't believe the same kind of rigor can actually be applied to introspective processes that can be applied to science. I mean, science develops theories through mostly inductive and deductive reasoning, which need to be weeded out, and there's a certain amount of rigor that's required because there's so much bullshit that can be produced through those methodologies. And I think one of the things, in my opinion, that science has served us is to look into those processes that we can't self-introspect very well and eliminate a lot of the things, a lot of the illusions that Don's referred to over the past couple of days that we may not have been able to and probably wouldn't have been able to do introspectively. But by looking at content and by reasoning, we've been able to learn more and more about ourselves and really our illusions, our Maya. So that's
I'd like to say something about that. So thank you for those comments. Of course, when you say look at C450 in the liver and so on, I mean, we've done a great job with that. It's not by just sitting and imagining it, but there are ways of looking. So similarly, the fact that we're talking about it means we know a lot about it. But I know, I go there. So so if we're interested in improving introspection, I again, I don't want to make some hypothesis about some absolute or pure or direct or without a method or time, but if we're interested in just improving introspective abilities, then certainly there may be ways that technology could help do that, A, more effectively, and B, take a heck of a lot less time than doing 10 days of Vipassana or something. Jesus, I'd die in the first hour. So for example, I give you two simple examples. These are just examples with technology. And again, I don't want it to be more than it is. One, and we got this from someone who's interested in, for example, Krishnaji said, are you aware of your thoughts and feelings every day? And one of his suggestions to people, not in talks and so on, has been, but in smaller groups, why don't you write a diary? Why don't you do something in the evening and try and record and then look at it? And that's, possibly a way of introspecting. And even that's not so easy to do in terms of accurately recording your thoughts and feelings over the course of a day, even with the best of intent and with time and so on. But now with technology, it's very, very easy because you can have a gadget that goes off randomly over the course of the day. You don't know when it's going to go off. Like, you randomly program an alarm in your cell phone, and then you just answer 3 or 4 questions that it gives you. What are you doing? How are you feeling? It gives you choices. And you can produce a fantastic record of how you've been feeling 20 or 25 times over the course of the day without taking away more than 30 or 40 seconds each time. That has, far more accuracy than if you were to do it at the end of the day. I'm not saying it's absolute truth or something. So that's one extremely simple example. And that kind of thing is being done quite a lot now. It has many applications. Another example that's a little more out there, that actually now combines what's going on inside you. So supposing you are interested in getting direct feedback about your breathing, it would be extraordinarily simple, and it is, to put some electrodes that measure breathing and to feed that current directly into your brain through the skin or something. You just attach it to something that vibrates. So you will open up, and Don was saying yesterday something about expanding senses or developing new ones, and it's not at all difficult to do that if you want to do that. So you could develop a sense of constantly letting your brain in its conscious domain know when you're breathing and how you're breathing and what the rate is and all of that. If you think that's going to help, you can do that. Very straightforward technology. You can now do that for brain activity as well. So you could be probing different things in your brain that that are not today in the realm of conscious awareness, as in I am conscious of it. You could digitize, so you can collect that signal fairly easily, you could digitize it, and you could feed it back to your brain, to those areas in your brain that are consciously perceiving things. So there are many such things that could be done. So then introspection, as we use that word, and the challenge of introspection for processes that are typically not in the realm of conscious awareness, is becoming much easier to do than was 10 years back or 20 years back.
Hello? Yeah. I want to be a little bit blunt, but I don't mean bad. We are all good people, I think, and but I see so much incoherence in this dialogue, and I think it's clearly it's a lack of being responsible, as was mentioned early about what we're saying, because if we were responsible, then we will have we will pause a little bit, to be careful about all the concept that we are using. For example, let's talk about cooperation. I mean, ants cooperate and they don't have an identity, and the cells cooperate and they don't have an identity. So it's very simple. Cooperation, the only cooperation, the only cooperation that has a value is the cooperation that is without identity, because it's the one that has depth, and also actually is not formal. So that's the point about cooperation. And now it's true that there's a lot of self-deception, but the point is not self-deception, because the self is always going to be deceptive, no matter what. So it doesn't matter if we are self-deceptive. The point is to question the self. And question the self, you also question the deception, which are the same thing. I don't think Krishnamurti proposed introspection whatsoever. I mean, Krishnamurti is not about introspection. I know he proposed examination of ourselves, of course, but that's not the point. The point is not introspection. You will waste your time if you're introspecting. The point is, and actually that word was created by Wilhelm Wundt, it's a long time ago in another setting. The word introspection has a very strict meaning. So the issue is to have a certain coherency that value depth, and that has to do also with evolution, because evolution is not about, I mean, there's two general proposals in evolution: the gradual proposal and the more punctualistic proposal, which explain why there is so much gap in the fossil records. And these gaps, of course, they are shrinking, but still there's gaps. And those gaps actually are very, along what Krishnamurti say, because the gap, we are looking for a gap. And I think the important question about evolution is the gap that we need to have a different brain, a brain that is compassionate. So that, yeah, it's a comment. It's more than a question. There are comments. So it's just. So the point is that the evolution, natural evolution is consistent with what Krishnamurti say, because there is gap and evolution, and that's where the mutation kicks in, and so I don't see any contradiction. In fact, I would suggest that natural selection should be natural non-selection. So to move forward, it's the only, I think, important question is to have that mutation in the brain, which will change evolution. Most of unexplained changes in evolution are explained by mutation. So that's is an access to the space-time that we're talking about. But space, I don't see any difference between this, getting out of the space-time, because if we stay with space, more importantly, in our brain, then that will give us access to a compassionate society, a more coherent society, a society that, that has some real spirituality. So that's my comment. I think we should make this dialogue more fluid and be conscious about every term that we use, and I think the scientific method is just the basic of it is unbiased observation, and that is possible. I think the whole point is that we can be unbiased by leave observation to do its course, to do its movement. It's a quality of love. So that's my comment. Thank you.
I think both physics and or physical sciences and biological sciences explain how different species have arisen, how our body has formed, and how we have come upon features which we have, both mental and physical. And similarly, space, time, and energy, and so on. So what science is saying is mostly not false. Most of it is probably true, though we can't be sure. As he said, you have always to posit possibility of something being falsified, and they are testing that all the time. The question is, there is nothing much you can do about all that. All that is only explanation of the past history of evolution and so on. It is already over. We are where we are. And what you see actually is that there is a lot of psychological suffering in human beings. And the religious quest has been a quest for addressing this issue. Not about evolution or this and that. That we accept that all that, and it is useful as knowledge, but not as self-knowledge. Self-knowledge means what is the right use of the faculties nature has given us, like thinking, capacity for language, imagination, enhanced capacity for memory, and so on. And what is the wrong use? Not right and wrong in some moral sense, but that which leads to happiness, which leads to health, is right, and that which leads to unhappiness and misery is wrong in that sense. So, what Krishnamurti has stressed is that we need to have self-knowledge, learn about ourselves through watching ourselves and through watching the way we are thinking and approaching life, and discovering which ways lead to misery, both for ourselves and for society in general, because society is just lots of people like ourselves. And that is self-knowledge which you can't get from a book. You have to do that for yourself, because only when you perceive the danger of that way of approaching life will it change. The rest is all like philosophy. You can read what the Buddha said, you can read what Jesus Christ said, and you can become a professor of Buddhist philosophy, but a professor of Buddhist philosophy is not the Buddha. Professor of Christian theology is not Jesus Christ. So the religious question is, how does one come upon that consciousness? And are we saying that biologically and scientifically that's not possible, that human beings cannot change? When you look at that question for yourself, you find that one may not know if it's possible to be completely free, what they call liberation and so on, but that human beings can grow in wisdom through self-knowledge. And as you grow in wisdom, changes happen as a byproduct of that wisdom, of that understanding. This is an observable fact in one's own life. Whether one would, not every physicist becomes Einstein, right? In the same way, not everyone may come to liberation, but there are people who are wiser than other people. So how does one come upon wisdom? Not just knowledge, wisdom being different from knowledge. Wisdom is a byproduct of this self-knowledge which comes, and that method suggested by Krishnamurti of religious inquiry is not introspective, because it is he says, don't judge, don't justify. Don't think about it and say this is good, this is bad. Just watch cause and effect, what is taking place in your consciousness, and you will yourself discover that a lot of your sorrow and difficulties and conflicts are arising out of something you yourself create. which is not part of nature. You think that way, therefore it arises. And that's what he calls the illusion. It's very similar to the Buddha's teaching that sorrow exists, that it has a cause, and the cause is ignorance, and that ignorance can be eliminated. So all this approach, which we have been talking for the last 2 days, about reality and what we see and the deception in that, is part of philosophy. You can read Bertrand Russell and so on. They have already talked about these problems. It's valid. Philosophy is valid part of knowledge, and so is science and biology. But it doesn't address the question of human psychological suffering, given a human being the way he is already constructed biologically and scientifically. That's just a comment.
I'd like to just make a comment that sort of, I think, relates to both these comments. A part of being responsible for all this is understanding how to ask the right questions. And to use cooperation, I think, is a great example. If we look at ants or we look in nature and we see examples of what we call cooperation, and then we apply those examples or we use those examples as means to determine whether or not human beings are or are not cooperating, we may not actually be asking much of a question about cooperation. The real question would be, what is cooperation actually for human beings, given all that human beings are? It may not look anything like how ants cooperate, just as an example. So in seeing examples in nature, if we apply those examples to our own behavior, we may set ourselves up for a kind of conflict of our own that's born out of who and what we are, because we're applying something that we see and we think is correct, but we're not actually asking the right question, which is, what is cooperation, given all that we are? That includes that we assume we are separate entities with egos or our own desires. What does it look like actually? So there's something about asking the right question already has a different activity than finding what we think is the solution and attempting to apply it to our lives. Something like that. And that may be a kind of rigor that's beyond a scientific rigor, but more an essential kind of thing. It's interesting. So how do we ask the right questions? And are we aware of what our questions imply about what we're looking at and how we think that's going to affect or what that implies for our lives? I don't know, something like that. I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Wonderful point. Very, very good. From a scientific approach to cooperation, we can try to give precise mathematical definitions of what we mean, like in terms of evolutionary game theory and so forth. We can then ask whether those precise mathematical definitions are actually capturing what we mean in the human context or not, but we can have a very precise discussion of what we mean by cooperation where we actually get mathematically precise about what we mean. When we actually study cooperation in humans and the impacts on us is quite interesting. A paleoanthropologist named John Hawkes, Hawks, has examined the skulls of our ancestors for the last tens of thousands of years and measured the volumes of the crania, which is a measure essentially of our brain volume. And it's quite striking. The brain volume of our hominid ancestors was increasing until about 20,000 years ago. Roughly about the time we got agriculture and cooperation. Because as hunter-gatherers, you need to cooperate with a small group, but with agriculture, you actually have a much bigger social structure, a much greater need for cooperation. And with crops, you've spent all year growing the crops. It's very tempting for someone else, a marauder, to bring their team in there and steal your crops and waste your whole year. So now you need bigger social cooperation to defend you. So in other words, that set up huge cooperating societies and then antagonism. And so what happened to our brains? Our brain volume in the last 20,000 years has plummeted. We have lost, well, we have lost 10% of our brain volume in 20,000 years. The volume of a tennis ball. So whether it's big or not, it's the volume of a tennis ball in only 20,000 years. And the question is why? What's gone on? John Hawkes looked at the data and found that in the regions in which there was the greatest social concentration, the greatest cooperation, the brain volumes dropped the most quickly, suggesting a very interesting hypothesis that as hunter-gatherers, when you're on your own or with a very, very small group, the selection pressures on you are enormous. If you cannot make your own clothes and hunt your own food and take care of your own infections or any of these other things, you die. Evolution by natural selection is a really nasty, harsh teacher. It kills those who don't get the lessons. So it's really, really harsh. So anybody who was anything less than robust and brilliant got wiped away. But now you have a social safety network. How many of us know how to make our own clothes? I don't. Most of the stuff that I have, someone else did. The selection pressures are no longer on me to be good, a jack of all trades. I'm not a jack of all trades. I can have an IQ of 70 and be just fine. I can go to Trader Joe's, I can get my food. But if I'm a hunter-gatherer and it's all on me, I'm probably going to be selected out. But now I can have kids. And so what's happened, the idea is that an unexpected consequence of our cooperation was our brain shrunk. And for all we know, they're continuing to shrink. And so one thing, and who would ever have, how many of you would have predicted that? My introspection about cooperation and human clearly makes me predict that our brains will be shrinking. None of us. So this is a case where we need to have both techniques working together. We need the introspection. We need to look inside ourselves as much as we can and learn about human nature as much as we can from that point of view. But we also need to step back and look at where we're going to be blind in introspection. None of us would have, I was stunned, but I was only stunned for a minute because I know evolutionary game theory. And as soon as Hawkes said that, I said, of course. As soon as you know evolutionary game theory, it's just sort of obvious that that would be the way things come out. And so we can get science can give us tools that will actually be, and we use this in my field, cognitive levers. Introspection by itself is powerful, but science can give us cognitive levers to make it even more powerful. With understanding of evolutionary game theory, I can now actually ask what would happen in the case of cooperation and get different answers than I would have without the scientific understanding. And one other thing about human suffering. That's really important because it is like the example of the medical thing where we were cutting people up and people are suffering physically, and we'd like to figure out what's going on there. In science, the only mathematically precise theory that we have right now of human suffering is evolutionary psychology. And it is a mathematically precise theory. And one of the things that comes out of that theory is that it says there are no selection pressures for our different little modules to necessarily be coherent. So for example, I can both love my brother, my literal physical brother, and hate him at the same time. And the question is why? So, I love my brother. I would, in some cases, give my life for him. And the moment later, I'm fighting him. Why is that? Why do I have these contradictory things? And an evolutionary point of view says, look, on the one hand, you share 50% of your genes with your brother. There are going to be selection pressures for you to cooperate and love your brother because that will propagate those genes. On the other hand, you share 100% of your genes with yourself. There's a conflict. And so what happens in evolutionary psychology is we find that there are these little modules that we've evolved to solve different social problems, and they don't necessarily have selection pressures to make them all coordinate. And so that conflict leads to what we call the internal conflicts and the suffering that comes out of that. Now, I'll say again, I don't think evolutionary psychology is the final theory at all. But it's the best tool we have so far that makes mathematically precise predictions about when we will cooperate, when we won't, when we will have conflict, and when we won't. I am here to look for a deeper theory. I would love to have a deeper theory, partly based on introspection, partly based on spiritual principles, that will do the following thing. It will be a deeper theory that encompasses evolution by natural selection as a special case. I want a theory that loses none of the insights of evolution by natural selection. You don't make progress by throwing away what you've already learned. So whatever new theory needs to be at least as powerful in its predictive tools as evolutionary psychology, not less. But I want something deeper that makes new predictions that I couldn't make within evolutionary psychology. And so what that means is, in some sense, and the reason I'm here is I'm trying to get new ideas from the spiritual traditions, throw my mind out of the old boxes that I'm in, think outside the evolutionary psychology box, not because I'm going to throw evolutionary psychology away. I'm looking for something deeper, of which evolutionary psychology is a special case, in much the same way that Newton can be viewed as a special case of Einstein, as the speed of light goes to infinity, and Newton can be viewed as a special case of quantum theory as Planck's constant goes to zero. I would like to have a deeper spiritual understanding of human suffering in which evolutionary psychology explanations are the limiting case when you take that deeper theory and project it into space-time, would be what I'm hoping. So. That would be one of the goals, would actually be to do that kind of thing, to actually predict what marriages would be more likely to be successful. Maybe we could do brain scans and say, you know what, maybe you should look over here.
Yeah. So,
I mean, that's a trivial question, and it's not at all difficult, and there is a lot of work that has been done on predicting that. There's no mystery to that. And while it's not perfect, because people don't undergo, that's a very silly retort, because people don't undergo and get evaluated for that, not because we don't know how to predict that. That's absurd.
yes. So first is a question from the stream, and then Raman, and then Asha. So a person called Romy Amory, hello. Why do you, and I don't know who the you is, maybe one of yours, why do you assume that the ego causes suffering? who said that, but whoever said that could respond. If there are no takers, then I move on.
I can I will speak about it not from a spiritual point of view, but from the evolutionary point of view, and I would love to hear from a spiritual point of view. So, the reason from an evolutionary point of view that I would think about the story I told was that we spend some of our calories building a model of the world and ourselves so that we can make predictions. We can simulate what will happen. What will happen if I go and play with that bear in its den? It turns out not to be something I really want to do, so maybe I won't actually. So I can die in my simulation, but so that I don't die in person. That's sort of the point of this. And so it allows us to anticipate. If you don't have a simulation with an ego, you're not anticipating future pain. And so you're not suffering. I don't expect, although I could be wrong, that E. coli worries about the future because it's not building a model of the future. So it's not anticipating future pain, and so it doesn't feel that suffering. We, on the other hand, have this very elaborate model in which we're anticipating the future, and the model is there specifically for us to run simulations about what if I did this? What would happen to me then? And among the simulations is, what happens when I get pneumonia when I'm 88 and I start to die? That leads to a certain kind of psychological suffering. It's not a fun simulation, and it's one that we know eventually is going to eventually, in some form, come true. So because we have this ability to simulate, and the suffering comes in as telling us, it's a signal from evolution saying, don't go into the bear's den, that's a really bad idea. Suffering will happen. Feel a little bit of the suffering that you might have. It's the anticipation. So the reason we suffer is from an evolutionary point of view. And again, I'm just within the limits of evolutionary theory. It's not the final word, but it's the best theory we have so far. It's an adaptive consequence of that whole approach, of figuring out how to avoid dying. We die in our simulations so we don't die in person. But in the simulations that we're running, we're experiencing the pains. Not as vividly as in person, but that's part of the whole simulation process. Now again, I would love a deeper theory. A deeper theory from a purely non-spatial temporal point of view about human suffering. And there, again, look to Krishnamurti and sages to give insights into that deeper view. Again, not to throw away this story from evolution, but to enhance it, to show that this is a special case of a deeper theory.
Just as a on top of everything you've just said, I think this is another opportunity just to look at how we phrase the kinds of questions we're asking. Asking a question like, why does the ego cause suffering, may not avail us of any real information. We may be able to build theories about I mean more in an introspective sense, asking this question of oneself. I can ask, why does the ego cause suffering? But in that question, I've already sort of posed the kind of answer I want or need in the questioning. So a more accurate question would be, what is suffering? And are there causes of suffering? What would those be? It may not even be that it's a thing. It could be a whole process. It could be so many things. But unless I ask the right question, I don't really avail myself of the ability to understand it. I end up creating just a certain perspective that I look at my suffering. So it's more to say there's something important about how the kinds of questions we ask in that regard, more in an introspective sense. I mean, not refuting or denying any scientific, but yeah.
I just wanted to add one question that Krishnamurti asked seemed like out of the box. He asked whether there is such a thing as a state of cooperation which is not dependent on the presence of an object or a subject.
It's an interesting question. There's some interesting data that may pertain to that within our own skulls. So each of us has two hemispheres. And the two are connected by the corpus callosum. And there seems to be two separate personalities. We can get evidence that the right hemisphere has a different personality than the left. In fact, they can have contradictory beliefs. And yet, there also may be, at least when we introspect, we feel of ourselves that we're one person. Although that's fallible, who knows? When they look at these split brain, when they do a split brain operation, Gazzaniga has asked the left hemisphere, is there anything different about your experiential world than before? Is there anything it was like now that's different? And I was very eager to hear that answer. And the left hemisphere said, nothing. Nothing to see here. There's nothing. And for me, as a cognitive neuroscientist, that was a stunning answer, because that left hemisphere was just disconnected from 43 billion neurons. And it says, nothing to see here. That is a remarkable piece of data. And so I wrote to Gazzaniga. And I said, that's stunning, but we know the left hemisphere is a confabulator. It makes up stories. I'm really interested in the right hemisphere, because the right hemisphere tends to be the one that faces reality. So I said to Mike, what about the right hemisphere? And he wrote back to me, he said, great question. I wrote it in my book, read my book. So, so I got his book. And in the book, the right hemisphere also says the same thing. Nothing to see here. So it's really, that is fundamental data that I think may be really important in understanding cooperation and what happens when two separate consciousnesses cooperate. We have good evidence that when we cut the corpus callosum, each hemisphere is a sphere of separate consciousness. I can actually do an experiment in which I show a person a phrase on the screen, keyring. So I flash up the phrase keyring. And if I make sure that key is to the left of where the person was looking and ring is to the right, then I can arrange it such that the right hemisphere is conscious of the word key, but not the word ring. And the left hemisphere is conscious of the word ring, and it's not conscious of the word key. And so I can arrange that the contents of consciousness of the two hemispheres is utterly different. And if I ask the person, what did I show you? The left hemisphere, which is the one that can talk, both understand language, but only the left hemisphere talks. When you ask the person, what did you see? The left hemisphere says, I saw a ring. And you say, well, what kind of ring? A wedding ring, key ring, doorbell ring? I don't know, just ring. If you ask the right hemisphere, and you can do that by a number of, if you want, I'll tell you how we do it, but I'll just tell you, we can ask the right hemisphere and not, the left hemisphere is left out of the loop. The right hemisphere says, I saw the word key. You can use Scrabble pieces to spell out the word key. Or you can point to a picture of a key. Or you can give it a box and it can pick stuff out and it'll pick out a key. but not a key ring and not the word ring. So we know that the two hemispheres inside your own head can have utterly different contents of consciousness, utterly different personalities. When they're together, cooperating, that's why I'm bringing up this, well, maybe cooperating, but possibly cooperating with the corpus callosum, you get what feels like a unified consciousness. But as soon as you split that in half, both hemispheres say the consciousness of that hemisphere apparently was unaware of the unified consciousness of the two. And now for me, that's a really fundamental. So when the two cooperate, something new, perhaps, and now I'm theorizing, perhaps a new consciousness, which is the single dawn, creates. But the two consciousnesses which are cooperating to do that are themselves unable to be aware of that higher consciousness. And if that's right, here we are all cooperating. We're all here for a similar purpose. We're trying to understand who we are. We're cooperating. We're sharing ideas. Perhaps there's a new consciousness that's arising out of that cooperation. I myself don't experience it. Is that and maybe someone here does, but is it a fundamental principle of consciousness that consciousnesses can cooperate? They will form new higher level consciousnesses, but the lower level entities will not have access to the higher level consciousness. Is that a principle about cooperation that we might not have gotten through introspection, partly because our introspection necessarily cannot see up? I don't know. But this is where introspection and science can lead to a deeper, and if there is a way, perhaps our introspection can't take us there, are there other ways? Could we use science to develop a technology to help us understand, or not? I don't know the answer to it, but it's a really, so the issue of cooperation is a really interesting one, and the consciousness that emerged from it. And I would love to actually explore it technically.
So what did, sorry. Quickly, Raman, what did you say? Cooperation without an object or a subject? Right. Yes, exactly. And to me, that's one of the issues that, creating all these sort of misunderstandings of what Krishnamurti might have meant, and it's one of these naive things about cooperation being operationalized as getting along with someone else, and being irritated with him means you're not cooperating, and it has nothing to do with that one way or the other. It's clearly, for me, a state of sort of interfering or not interfering inappropriately, is not at all reflected in a behavior. It's absurd to say that because killings are up or killings are down in wars that we're cooperating or not cooperating. That has nothing to do with it. And then this silly sticking to these absolutely incorrect narratives, regardless of where they come from, that killings are going up, so we're not cooperating, or in terms of relationship. Anyway, I think, yeah, I'll stop there.
So this, and then one more question.
I wanted to make just an observation that it's interesting to me, and I mean this in the right sense. I don't mean this in a challenging or hostile sense, really, but it's interesting to me that all the comments and questions are coming from men. And I think there's a reason for that. And to go back to something that I think Corey was talking about, the Buddhist teaching about suffering is that there's a difference between pain and suffering. And pain is just what we experience emotionally, physically, whatever. Suffering is what we do with the pain in terms of maybe perception or thinking. So that's always been a helpful distinction for me to think about those two differently. The research at UCLA, I think, and I may have this wrong, you would know far better than I, but some of the research studies indicates that the corpus callosum in females is much larger than in males. Are you familiar with that work? In mm-hmm. Okay, and that the significance of that is that the neurons going between the two sides of the brain are increased if that connection is larger. And so it seems to me that what we're grappling for here in terms of science, and again, these are gross generalizations, but science, left brain, maybe, religion, spiritual reality, perceived right brain more, that what we're grappling for is a more unified brain function in humans, which may be why women understand spirituality very differently than men do. I just throw that out as an observation. And so I think it's hard because much of the discussion and work here is on a scientific kind of left brain analytical value system. And so that's not really how females typically process things. Not that females can't be scientists, they certainly can. But as females, in terms of how our brains are wired differently, that what seems to us to be totally obvious, men seem to sometimes have to get to through a very laborious process, in this case called science.
Well, who wants to have the last question? Asha. Yeah, good, Asha. Help this laborious man.
No. Maybe I should put this down. Stop the labor.
Women have the last word
Making it heavy for me. That makes a heavy load for me to carry. Anyway, first of all, I think maybe the volume of the brain did decrease, but the surface area increased because it became a very, like a walnut, a very gyrated structure in the brain. So it's the surface area that made it possible to communicate even more because more neurons and more areas could be connected. Maybe. I don't know the facts of it. You will tell us. And also in the male and female, it's like the corpus callosum is a connecting fiber between the right and the left brain. Maybe it just makes it possible for the relationship between the two, which all of us need to have. Maybe it's a showing up of the possibility of what's there to make a complete picture by communicating between the right and the left, or between anyone, between two human beings. And it improves relationship. And another thing that came to mind was that Kay said that we keep, through science, through various things, we keep finding things, but we are still in the field of the known. We somehow stick there because that's what we know, and we can investigate it more and display it more, but that's where we feel comfortable and that's where we stay. That's where we can prove it or disprove it. So we like to be comfortable as human beings. So when is it that we go to the end of that field, to the fence? Do we ever cross into the unknown? That's where the thing is so vast. We think this is vast. It's like the universe up there and the universe inside us. And there is such order, they don't collide. Everything proceeds in order until we begin to interfere with it. So if we can perceive that order, and if we can communicate with each other with care, as you said, Doctor, I think maybe it might be a different world. It won't be a female or a male perception, but it'll be a more understanding perception. And what prevents that communication? Because somehow, even I mean, I'm the last person, I suppose he's saying, who's come to question. And I came to you 2-3 times with questions. And you said you asked them. My goodness, even my voice is shaking now. It's very hard to sit amongst people because it's interesting that we as humans feel threatened of each other instead of feeling a friendship, a kind of sharing, a kind of being able to display myself and not be afraid of what he's thinking of me. Or it doesn't matter really. So maybe there's something in communication and relationship we need to look at, or go beyond this field that we know, that we feel comfortable in, and get to a very uncomfortable place to find out what we're doing. Thank you.
Both of these comments are really quite interesting. It's in terms of males and female brains, imaging studies do indicate a very different style. When men and women do the same task, this is something of a generalization, but it seems to be the case that men tend to be lateralized. One hemisphere or the other is more active, and it tends to be a smaller area of the brain that's active. And women doing the same cognitive task tend to get more bilateral activation and more regions in each hemisphere. So it's the same task but being done in very, very different ways. So, and then I mentioned yesterday Jim Fallon's research that shows that our emotional wiring, I didn't say this actually, 95% of the emotional wiring is different. The subnuclei and the amygdala that are active in women are 95% different than the subnuclei that are active in men. So now there's been pushback by some actual female scientists saying that the gender differences are overstated. I've looked at that work and I'm unconvinced. I think the gender differences are real. But we'll see. But so right now I think that the data is clear that there are different cognitive styles between men and women. And so it's easy for us to misunderstand each other and to have different styles in these kinds of questions and so forth. And so it's very important that for all of us in terms of cooperation to understand that assumptions I'm making about how you're thinking about what I'm saying and how you're feeling about what I'm saying are very male-centered assumptions on my part. And all I can do is sort of simulate in my head what I think you'd be thinking and feeling when you heard this stuff. And of course, since your wiring is different from mine, I'm going to get the wrong answer most of the time. And so, the best I can do is to, when I look at your behavior, is to say, what would I have to be thinking and feeling to be behaving that way? And as a man, sometimes I might get the answer, I would have to be a jerk. But that's because for a man it would be, you'd have to be a jerk, but not for a woman. For a woman, she's actually seeing things in a completely different way. And for her, it's perfectly loving and kind and the kind of, and so actually this is really important in our relationships. We come into, again, I'm talking about heterosexual relationships in this case. You love this person and you get married and she says something and I say, or does something and I make, okay, what would I have to be thinking and feeling to have said that or done that? And I come up with the wrong answer. Like, I would have to be actually sort of being a bit of a jerk. And so now I start to build a model of this person. Well, they acted like a jerk there. Now I'm a good Bayesian. I now start to begin to predict that they will, and I get more confirmation. wow, look at what she did there. I would have to be and so I build up this model of that person as a jerk. And it's all based on me projecting what I would have to be thinking and feeling and choosing to do if I was acting that way. And I get the wrong answer. So part of, I think, the last two questions are really, really important. Here we are all together wanting to cooperate. I think all the men are in a very male way really trying to cooperate and understand, and all the women are in their own way trying to cooperate. And there will be misunderstandings among us. And so the issue is to really try to understand that we're all cooperating, we're doing the best we can, and what I think about what you're doing is probably wrong, and what you're thinking about what I'm trying to do is probably wrong, and so we will have to dialogue to, he really wasn't trying to be a jerk or whatever. But that's part of so this whole thing is itself an instantiation of what we're trying to learn. What is cooperation? Sure.
Yeah. Raphael, we can work on this afternoon, or in the break. We have the break now, and we can share more. Thanks for working on this, and thanks for all the input.